Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can check out the podcast on Google, Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you listen to podcasts pretty much, and as well as the YouTube channel. In addition to all of the regular podcast episodes, we also have interviews with filmmakers and that you can listen to, and that is anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema, where you will get exclusive early access to reviews, both new and old, as well as a new series, Leaving the Collection, wherein I look at a movie from my physical movie collection for one last time, give it a brief review, as well as explain why I feel like its place in my collection has run its course, and that's at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So we've come to another October, and October, of course, means talking about horror movies, and we're going to be talking about several this year between the episodes I had planned. But we're going to start by talking about some of those movies within the context of their soundtracks. And join me to discuss movie soundtracks is somebody whom I met on Twitter a couple of years ago. I've been wanting to have her on the podcast for a while, and I'm looking forward to actually talking to her about film music for the first time. Dr. Becky O'Brien. Becky, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad we could finally work this out.
I am too, and it's funny because of the fact that originally the plan was to just talk about, some of your favorite soundtracks, and we would just or three soundtracks that you kind of wanted to talk about. And then when you emailed back, it's like, I'd like to focus on horror soundtracks. It's like, well, we'll just tie this into talking about horror movies. And I love the fact that we start off there. But before we get to that subject, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and because you're also a musicologist as well, which was one. And I know one of the things when you post online, you post a lot about film music and interviews with composers, and that's one of the things that was really interesting about having you on, for me at least.
Yeah, well, I am a musicologist. I've got my PhD in musicology. I've earned it 3 years ago at the University of Kentucky. I've been blogging about film music and films for going on 7 years now. I started while I was working on my thesis. It was just supposed to be for fun, and to my shock and surprise, it grew. and yeah, I like to post. I like to post about this soundtrack I've discovered, and although now I feel like in the last couple of years my focus has shifted more towards talking to composers and trying to bring that process out so more people can know about it. Because I feel like if you know more about how a soundtrack was made, you have that much more respect for that part of the film.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And I mean, it's actually kind of funny. I would actually, with Sonic Cinema, I almost kind of feel like that's how it happened too, where it's like I started writing about movie reviews. I started writing movie reviews because, I enjoyed talking about movies and stuff like that. And then over the years, it just expanded and grew into something that is basically as important to me as my day job, and to a certain extent, even more important to me. I mean, for me, I've really gotten a great appreciation about film music over the years, and I've been obsessed with film music for most of my life, and I've done a few short films and stuff like that before. I actually did just score my first feature film, and I'll more on that in the coming weeks for people who've been kind of curious about that. And one of the things that I find interesting about that is it really, first of all, what was it about film music that interested you when you first started getting into it?
Well, like I've been a fan of film music since before I knew that's what I was really paying attention to. I can remember being a kid and I was there's a skill that some musicians have. It's called audiation, where you can play pieces of music in your head. And as a kid, I was doing that with Star Wars music. And I realized as I got older that the parts of the movie I was gravitating towards were the bits with the loudest music, which inevitably meant I listened to a lot of films scored by John Williams because, he's a master of making those big musical flourishes. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of grew from there, because when I went off to college, it was like it started off as music education. And as I got in the latter half of my studies, I was like, wait, you can study film music? That's a thing? You can write about it and people will pay you to do it? Sign me up. And yeah, so that's how I ended up in graduate school to learn about all this. And it kind of went from there. But yeah, the music just drew me in from the earliest age, and it also helped, aside from Star Wars and stuff, I got a thorough grounding in movie classics from my parents. Every year I would watch The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, Spartacus, all the big movie epics with the scores to match. And so I knew all about symphonic type film music from the earliest age. And yeah.
Okay. What has been one of the most surprising things, whether it's something that you learned while you were studying music, film music, or whether it was something that you learned in talking to film composers, what's been one of the most surprising things about film music that you've learned?
Oh gosh, at all. I mean, there's so much I've learned. Trying to think, I've had a couple interviews lately. What have we been talking about? Probably one of the more surprising things I've learned is how short the turnaround time can be in getting some of these scores done. Mm-hmm. Well, the thing with writing film scores is there's no set period of time that a composer has to do it. Some composers have told me they had the better part of a year to get the music together. Even before COVID, by the way, they would sometimes have these long periods. One composer had a month, maybe a month and a half to get the whole thing written, orchestrated, and recorded, which is for a full-length film, that is not a lot of time.
No.
And so I'd say that's one of the more surprising things. But I mean, for film music in general, and this is related to what we're going to be talking about, and this is why I brought the subject up, is one of the things I learned about myself as I've been studying these is how much horror music soundtracks intrigue me, because I feel like they get a bad rap, because there's a lot of people who still poo-poo the horror genre as being somehow lesser than other genres, but it's I feel like people who say that haven't been paying attention, because a lot of these soundtracks are gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it's you're really missing out if you don't at least, if you don't want to watch the movie, fine, at least give the soundtrack a listen to. There's some beautiful music out there. Mm-hmm.
No, you're absolutely right, and we can go ahead and start pivoting towards that. Horror scores are fascinating to me because of the fact that even when you have something that is relatively low budget, kind of cheap, kind of exploitative, like say Friday 13th, which we're not talking about on this podcast, but I think is a great example of that, where you've got the movie, which is very much in an exploitative manner of the way it was shot, the way it was made, very, very low budget, but you have Manfredini's score, and of course the iconic theme that just really, it elevates it to a degree that you wouldn't have necessarily seen coming when you first saw the title Friday the 13th. What's that? That looks like a cheap horror movie, and it is, but at the same time, you have this music that just elevates it to in another degree entirely. And I think, and we'll certainly talk about a couple of themes here that are iconic. And, you know, I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about the horror genre, especially, is that when a composer captures a theme that just fits the movie, whether you're talking about Psycho, Jaws, Halloween, which is going to be the ones that we talk about, or Friday 13th, it really just takes everything to a new level and basically just shapes the genre for years to come.
Oh, absolutely.
So we will actually. I was debating how to do this, because of the fact that it's like normally I would go, we'll go over one of yours and then one of mine, but I kind of feel like chronologically makes more sense in this case, going by the year of release, because it's something where it wouldn't necessarily make as much sense to go back and forth, but at the same time, I think hearing the kind of evolution of what these soundtracks do, even though they're for sometimes very different examples of the genre, I think they also have interesting ways in which one soundtrack sort of builds on something else that the other soundtrack did. So we're going to start off with one that I chose, and this is from 1977, Dario Argento's Suspiria. The score is by the rock band Goblin. If you haven't seen the movie, it is basically the story of an American girl who goes to a dance school in Europe that happens to be populated by witches. That's pretty much that's basically the long and short of it. The thing that is so interesting about what Goblin does in this score is it has a fundamental rock base, but it also really keeps in that almost weird experimental classical tradition of horror movie scores that, with the use of the Celeste as well as the vocals at times, that's really quite intriguing. And I remember, because you posted about watching Suspiria. That was your first time seeing it, wasn't it?
Yep. I'm not going to forget it anytime soon, thanks to you.
I mean, I'm sorry or thank you, whichever one you prefer.
I mean that in a nice. I mean that in a nice way. I promise. But no, that movie literally seared itself onto my brain. Like, and the music was a big reason why. Like, as soon as it started, I was like, oh, that's why he picked this one.
Well, it's funny because of the fact that it does kind of tie into one of your choices with Halloween, because of the fact that one of the things that I'm always fascinated about, and this comes from me being an electronic composer, largely working electronics, but the use of unusual instruments or synthesizers or keyboards in film music. I'm always kind of fascinated by that. And we have a few great examples here. And I think Suspiria really kind of fits into that one. And it's funny because of the fact that I had seen this movie several years ago. I think it was when I first got onto Netflix, and they were primarily DVDs, so I rented it because I'd heard about it. And it's like, it's okay. That soundtrack is interesting. But overall, it didn't really do too much for me. And I watched it again a few years ago in preparation for the 2018 remake of it. And it definitely hit more. And the soundtrack, apart from reminding me that like Hans Zimmer, when he did his theme for The Ring, very much is quoting this theme pretty explicitly, actually. I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this is the use of synthesizers, the use of keyboards, but also there's a use of percussion that I think is really interesting. There are times where it's very much part of the atmosphere, and very much times where it's more rhythmic and building in suspense and tension as well. What are some of your thoughts on the score for Suspiria?
Well, one thing that jumped out at me almost literally is how they put their voices in there and they're literally saying witch.
Yeah.
in the soundtrack. I mean, if that's not a big clue drop, right? And this is right at the beginning of the film before we even, if you didn't think there was anything weird going on before that, the voice is going, witch, that definitely tells you there's something weird going to be happening in the story. So talk about your foreshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, I really like the part, I don't even know the track name, but it sounds like a music box. You know the part I mean?
Yeah.
And it's one of the themes that recurs throughout the movie, and it's such a contrast with like this beautiful little music box dance music clashing with the growing horror of Susie's situation.
Mm-hmm.
And when you combine that with like the vibrant, almost blinding colors in this film, it's a very unique experience when you add all the elements together.
Yeah, it really is. There is something very hallucinatory about this, and when you combine the images, when you combine the music, and admittedly, I'm not as familiar with Argento as probably I should be, but admittedly, this is one where you kind of get a sense of what he's about, and kind of what Italian horror is about. Like last year, a lot of people were praising James Wan's *Malignant* as a Gaio film, and I think Suspiria kind of works in that same vein, I think, but. Yeah, you're right about the vocals and the fact that it's basically saying witch. It's like, well, yeah, there's no subtlety here whatsoever. I love the way the vocal sound reminds me of some of the classical pieces we get in The Shining later, as well as Darth Maul's theme, where John Williams used like Sanskrit to really goose how ominous Darth Maul was in that movie.
Are you talking about Duel of the Fates?
Well, Duel of the Fates, but it's use of not necessarily Duel of the Fates, but there are a couple of cues in FMS, like when he first lands on Tatooine, and you get these.
Is there Sanskrit in there?
Huh?
Is there Sanskrit in there? I know the scene you're talking about.
It may not be Sanskrit, but it's at least these very quick vocal things where it's it's designed to be a very ominous sound. It's not
Yeah.
specifically in a choir setting like it is in Duel of the Fates, but
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's supposed to like increase, forgive the pun, the unintentional pun, but increase his menace.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think it works very well there. And then you get there's examples of in The Shining as well. And I think it's one of the Penderecki films or Penderecki pieces that Kubrick uses in that. And it's most notable in the scene after Jack kills Scatman Crothers' character. And
now, I'm ashamed to say I've never actually seen The Shining.
It's a tough sit. Admittedly, it is a tough sit, and sorry about the spoilers, but
it's fine. I mean, for once, I do know of it, and I know about the more famous moments in it.
Yeah.
So
yeah. But that's one that uses that type of vocal, those type of vocal effects as well, and I think that's something that Suspiria, the score in Suspiria, I think, does really well with those constant, almost chanting of the word witch, and you get a few times in the film, and it's really quite captivating when you put it next to like the way that they orchestrate the score, which is very much in the vein of like a rock band scoring a piece of film.
Yeah, I feel like it would have been a completely different movie experience had they given that film a traditional score.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would almost go so far as to say, I'm not sure the film would have worked with a traditional score. It almost needs that oddball sound to create the proper experience that is it Argento? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
To create the experience that Argento must have wanted.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think you're definitely onto something there. I mean, you could say that about several of the scores that we're going to be talking about, and where you can't imagine what another score will have done for it. And I think it's really it's really quite a testament to the way certain filmmakers envision their music, their film from a musical standpoint, that they have those ideas of, okay, this is what I want it to sound like. I don't want it to sound like anything else.
That's right. Didn't Goblin write the music before the film was ever shot?
I'm not exactly sure about that. That honestly would not surprise me. It's something other composers have done. I mean, I know Morricone did that for Leone a few times. So
yeah, because what I like to do when I watch a movie for the first time, I will find like all the bits of trivia I can to sort of flesh out my knowledge of it. And I swear I read a trivia point that said that the score was finished before a single frame was shot, and I was like, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's I'm looking at IMDb now, and yeah, they did write the music beforehand in order to play it on set.
That's right, because that added to that helped the actors' reactions to what was going on. Yeah. Which, if they were actually hearing that as a film, that explains a lot.
Yeah, it really does. No, I mean, and yeah, that is something that Morricone did that with Leone several times, and I mean, I know when Hans Zimmer did Dune, like he had been working on that for ages. Even I think he was working on that even before the movie was done, I think. But I know it's part of that was because of how much he loved Dune and was really anxious to work on it and help tell that story.
Yeah. Speaking of the colors in Suspiria and stuff, I learned something fascinating about it. You know how some of the scenes are tinted blue and green?
Yes.
I read that the scenes that are tinted that color, it's supposed to be understood that the room is dark. Which explains, because well, you remember how the one girl dies, Susie's friend?
Admittedly, it's been a few years since I've seen Suspiria.
Well, here's the thing. The screen's tinted blue when she dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it explains why, because from our point of view, it looks like she fell into an obvious trap. Like, why didn't she see it? Well, because we can see it, but she can't, because it's meant to be understood that the room is pitch dark, so she didn't see the obstacle that killed her.
Mm-hmm. And
I found it fascinating that he did that.
Yeah, I mean, that type of thing is really, when you hear of filmmakers who do that, it's really kind of fascinating to hear those things, because of the fact that, I mean, it keeps with the, it plays, not only allows him to make the film as stylish as he wants to be, but he also does things in order to enhance our perspective, while also understanding, okay, this is our perspective is not necessarily going to be the same as the character's perspective. And yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I may have to rewatch Suspiria this month. It's been like 4 or 5 years, so yeah.
Oh yeah, you're definitely due a rewatch then, because I was also fascinated with how diegetic music was treated. When Daniel's the pianist is playing for the dancers, you can't imagine how what's the word? Disorienting, I think, is the word, that a simple piece of piano music could be made to sound like.
Yeah.
Because it's just supposed to be a regular dance practice, but as soon as it starts, it all just feels wrong.
Mm-hmm.
In a very unsettling way. Like, as soon as it starts, something is going to happen.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'm definitely going to, now that we're talking about it, I'm definitely going to need to rewatch Suspiria this month, because I just listening to it and talking about the score is making me inspired to rewatch this movie. And just see if it's going to take it to yet another level that I didn't necessarily expect, even the last time rewatching it. But if you haven't had, I don't know if Suspiria is available. I mean, I'm sure it's available for like rent and stuff.
I actually you mean like getting a copy of it? Because there's actually Synapse Films has done a restored Blu-ray version of it.
Okay.
And that's how I got my copy.
Okay, and I actually just in Googling it see that it's on Tubi as well. So if you don't mind watching it with commercials, sign up for free for Tubi and go have a blast. I think they have a couple of other. I think they've had Inferno, or I might have been thinking of another. But they have Tubi has a great selection of horror films, typically month to month. So
yeah, but if you did happen to want to get a copy to keep, highly recommend Synapse Films version. It's been perfectly restored, and I think it's been done in 4K, and it wasn't all that expensive to get. I think I paid like $30 for it after tax.
Okay, that's not bad.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, because I know you bought it when we were talking about this. So yeah, okay, that is excellent. So yeah, be sure to check out Suspiria. I know I'm going to this month. I don't know if I will necessarily be able to buy the by that release right now, but yeah, it's something to keep in mind for the future. Uh, so the next one is actually one of your choices. It is 1978's Halloween, the iconic John Carpenter score and the iconic John Carpenter movie. We're about to get the
Halloween Ends. Yes, I'm
12th
looking
movie
forward
in
to
that franchise, I think. Is it 12?
I don't care. Oh, well, it depends. Are you counting them all or just the reboot? Because
I don't know. I'm just going off the top of my head. I can't remember exactly because it was like.
Hang on. I've got them all here. I will count. See, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think this is number 12.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, really, we could simply say, I mean, John Carpenter's theme for Halloween. Need we say more? Because let's face it, this is one of the definitive horror themes in movie history.
Yeah, because like if I could jump in on that, I have had an interesting relationship with this theme. So like I only recently got into I think it's been 2 years now since I finally took the plunge on Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd known of it for years, but it was always one of those, that's a scary movie, I can't watch scary movies, and it was just ingrained in my head. But and so before I'd ever seen the films, I'd heard the theme. Of course I had. Yeah. It's everywhere. But the weird thing is, before I saw the movie, the theme didn't do much for me. Mm-hmm. I didn't get it, if that makes sense. Because by itself, it's just a line of piano music.
Yeah.
You know, it's about as simple as you can get for film music. Mm-hmm. And so I'll never forget when I finally sat down to watch the original, scared out of my mind because of this film's reputation, mind you. The first time that theme hit, it's like something clicked in my head, and I was like, oh. Because when you hear it in context, it's genius. Yeah. How well it works, because it's like there's something it's not just what it is, it's how it's played. I can envision Carpenter, like he's not just playing on the piano, he's pounding those keys in like this staccato rhythm that just you feel it under your skin. Yeah. And once it goes a couple times, it's like an earworm that never stops, and you never quite know when it's going to start up again. Mm-hmm. Which makes the movie experience all the more unsettling.
Which is, you know, and that's the thing that's so brilliant about Halloween as a movie, where everything is what you see is relatively bloodless. There's not a lot of really vicious kills in Halloween.
Speak for yourself.
Well, I've seen slasher movies that have had way more vicious kills. But the thing is, so much of it is built out of atmosphere.
True, but yeah. I mean, okay, I know it's semi-spoiler. It's technically not a kill, but that whole scene with the knitting needle, come on, that's brutal.
Oh yeah. Oh, believe me, I mean, Carpenter goes for it in a way that nobody else really had by that point. I mean, you know, and but so much of what he does in that is because of that score. And,
and no, keep going.
And the fact that he has these moments where Laurie Strode is just walking down the street, and you you get that piano, you get that synthesizer. Her theme is really lovely, but at the same time, it still has that unsettling sound. And one of the things that's so striking to me about Carpenter as a composer is the fact that he's the filmmaker as well. So you would hope that he would have his finger on the pulse of what his movie requires musically. But the fact that he innately understands what a film requires or should have, almost in the same way of a John Williams, almost in the same way of a Jerry Goldsmith, who we'll be talking about this episode. It's really quite striking, the fact that not only can he be a great filmmaker and visual storyteller, he can be a great one from a musical perspective as well.
Oh, absolutely. And like whenever the time comes for, I know he's still alive and well, but when the time comes, I hope he's given his just due as a composer, not just as a filmmaker, because he, funnily enough, he kills it with all the music in this film. And it's all more impressive when you realize that they made Halloween on a bare bones budget. Most of the money went to getting Donald Pleasance in the film.
Yeah.
Which, like, when you know that makes it all the more impressive. Like, there's so many ways this film could have gone wrong and fallen flat, but it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, it's, the thing that is going to his score, the simplicity that you talked about is absolutely there, because and I can completely understand where if you haven't seen the movie but you've heard the score, you're like, I mean, okay, yeah, it's okay, but it doesn't really, it is a very simple score. But when you see it when you hear it with the images, it just gets, it's brute level effective.
Yeah.
In terms of how it works.
Especially when you've seen it more than once and you start figuring out where Michael is in relation to the music.
Yeah.
And once you start making that connection, then the fright level goes up a whole nother notch, because you start to make the connection like, oh my gosh, that music's for him. If you hear that music, he's around here somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the thing. He's everywhere. It is what you figure out by the end of the film. Like, so with that music playing, you're like, my gosh, he can pop up anywhere at any time. So there's never a chance to catch your breath, because as soon as you relax, he's there again.
Yeah.
But also there's another music thing I wanted to highlight since we were talking about it, and I feel like it may have been drowned out by the iconic theme, because of course everyone's going to remember that iconic theme the most, but there's also a really interesting musical moment that happens when Michael kills. Especially the first couple times the first couple teenagers he kills, the way that it's like, because for some reason I thought that iconic theme was the only thing associated with Michael. So I thought that's what we would hear when he killed, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's not. Those first couple kills, you get this large, it's almost a groan, somewhere between a groan and a scream that just drowns everything out.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I've thought about it, and I've almost wondered if that's meant to be like musically what's in Michael's head as he's doing this, like, or if that's just meant to represent Michael himself, because he's meant to be pure evil, right?
Yeah, that's the basic idea, is that he is not human. He is evil incarnate.
And so, like, I feel like that sound, because that sound, like, the first time I watched this Halloween, it gave me nightmares, and in my nightmares I heard not just the iconic theme, but that sound too, because that sound made my hair stand up. You know, it's like, you know, that's what evil must sound like, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
Because evil doesn't have shape. Evil doesn't have melody. Evil just pushes out at you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's one of those, it's essentially one of those pieces of music that's essentially it emphasizes a jump scare, and the way it does it in that case is just out and out terrifying, almost as much as the shower scene music in Psycho.
Oh yeah. I agree. But you know what's also interesting is Carpenter also knows when to not use music, which is just equally as hard. Case in point, you know the part of Halloween I find the absolute scariest.
What is that?
It's the scene late in the movie. Laurie has found her friends dead. She's sobbing in the hallway. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no music playing during that time, right?
If I remember correctly, yeah.
So all we hear is her crying, and in the silence, you suddenly see Michael's face appearing in the moonlight behind her.
Mm.
No music of any kind, no iconic theme, but I swear that is the most terrifying moment in the entire film.
Mm. The fact that they're and I think that is an important part about film music that really does not get discussed enough. Not just the use of music, which of course is, you know, is what most people remember, but more importantly, when you don't use music.
Yeah, and I've actually made sure to blog about that. One of my first posts, I wrote about iconic scenes that don't use music, like the chariot race in Ben-Hur. There's no music from the moment the race starts to the end. There's not one note of music.
Yeah.
That's one of the more iconic, classic examples. Or a more recent, still classic example. The first lightsaber fight in the original Star Wars between Obi-Wan and Vader.
Yeah.
That doesn't really have any music in it either.
No, not until the end.
Which is kind of ironic if you think about how lightsaber duels have developed since then.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and I've tried to emphasize to anyone who will listen that it's equally important to know when to leave the music off as opposed to putting it in, because if you overdo it, you'll ruin the moment, really, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes the audience needs to stew in what they've just experienced, and music can take them out of their feelings when you don't want them to.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And no, I mean, even in a score that he didn't necessarily write, like The Thing, he understands that innately. And the way, I mean, that's another score I absolutely love from his films, and Morricone. Like, that score is just so beautiful to me.
No, that's the Kurt Russell one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it might be like the only one that Carpenter has not, as a director, that Carpenter directed but did not necessarily do the music for. I think that's like one of the few films of his, if not the only one, that he did that with. But I think he still had a hand in the music, but ultimately you can also tell it's a Morricone score all the way through.
Morricone did The Thing?
Yeah. And you can tell. You can tell too. They're familiar with his work.
I am ashamed I did not know that.
Yeah.
No, I know of The Thing by reputation, so I've been too scared to watch it. But now that I know Morricone did it, I'm probably going to have to take the plunge now. So it's really an interesting
it's really an interesting collision of, and like I said, I mean, I'm sure Carpenter had ideas for the music, because I mean, you can also hear that it's very much a John Carpenter movie from the way the soundtrack works, but you can also tell it's a Morricone score too. Yeah. Like the two really fit really well together. But yeah, the thing is something where it definitely is it's very much as, I mean, it can be as terrifying as Halloween at times.
Oh, I'm sure. That's why I've hesitated so long.
But so yeah, Halloween. I mean, that's why I'm definitely going to revisit before Halloween ends, and I
find it fascinating that that theme has endured all these decades through all the films, no matter how good or bad they've gotten in the years since. That theme has always endured.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like you have that theme, you better be utilizing it. I mean, it's like the Jurassic Park movies with John Williams' theme. It's like, if you're not using that, then you're doing something wrong. So we are going to continue with another one of Becky's choices. This one is 1979's Alien, composed by Jerry Goldsmith. This is, and I'm really excited to talk about this one because I absolutely love this score. And
I gotta say that the 70s were a good decade for horror, weren't they?
They really were. I mean, and then we also had Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I don't really remember the film, a music in there, but that movie is just insanely scary in every way, shape, or form. But yeah, Alien ending the decade on quite a note as horror, but also being a strong science fiction movie.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that is so, and this is interesting. This is going to be our first discussion of Goldsmith, and I love that the two you chose both of the Goldsmith scores we're going to be talking about, and we'll talk about the other one later. The thing that I love is that both of these Goldsmith scores could ultimately not be any different in how they go about their business.
Absolutely. I mean, and not just because there's like 20 years between them, but I mean, you almost wouldn't think they came from the same person if you heard them back to back.
Yeah. Yeah, this one definitely feels more like the Goldsmith who did the Planet of the Apes score in the late 60s. Yeah. And really I love that it works off of simple motifs. The use of percussion is very sparse.
And so much sense. Oh my God, so much.
And I think that's really befitting considering how much of a slow burn this movie is.
Oh yeah, and the music when you hear it, because the thing with Alien is, like, even though I picked it, like the way this movie is put together, you almost don't notice the music.
Yeah.
It's woven in, and that's a compliment, because any composer I've talked to will tell you the audience isn't supposed to notice the music,
right?
Because it's all supposed to be blended together. That's why a lot of times, you know, when we study these soundtracks, we have to listen separately so we're not distracted. And I always have to do that with Alien because it's blended so well. I'll miss whole moments. Mm-hmm. because I'm too distracted by what's going on. But one of I love how the movie starts, though, because that's the one time you can hear the music cleanly.
Yeah.
As the title comes out, and that sets up right away that this is going to be a twisted story.
Mm-hmm.
If the title wasn't ominous enough, I mean, because there's something about just the way it's just alien. It's like, that doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
But combine that with the music and just the weird way the title pieces itself together. It's like, oh, you've got goosebumps and the story hasn't even gotten started yet.
Yeah.
And I also like how, and you're right calling it a slow burn, because for at least the whole first act, even after the chest burster scene, a lot of times the music just feels like it's, pacing itself, just biding its time, you keep waiting for this big spontaneous moment that doesn't really come until the very end of the film. And which works though, because by the time it does come, you're just quaking in your seat thinking, my God, how is this going to end? Is anyone getting out alive?
Right.
And like weirdly enough, the part I remember most about this movie isn't the music. The part doesn't exactly involve the music, but it involves the sound of the motion detector, which some could argue makes it part of the music. And I know a few musicologists who would definitely make that argument that that the sound should be considered part of the musical score because of the role it plays. Once that sound starts, that hits you just as hard as, say, the theme from Halloween.
Yeah.
And so I would swear they did that on purpose. It's almost treated musically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what you've said about the soundtrack is absolutely correct. This is one of those films where music and sound design start to bleed into one. And I think this is a great example of that. Another one that came out in 1979, but it's not a horror movie in strictest sense, is Tarkovsky's Stalker, which is very minimal in its use of music, but at the same time, a lot of what it is very much doubles as sound design for the film and to create just an otherworldly atmosphere. And I think especially with the use of percussion here, the fact that it's very simple motifs we get throughout. I mean, even moments like the landing sequence where you can tell that it's very much if you listen to it separately, it's very much almost a conventional way of scoring that type of scene. But at the same time, you don't really notice it. You're focused so much on everything else you're hearing in that moment.
Yeah, like when they're exploring the alien ship.
Yeah.
That's some beautiful, I think there is. Maybe I'm misremembering. There is some good music in that scene, if I remember.
Oh yeah.
And but you're so drawn into looking at the design of that ship, you just it's like in one ear out the other before you even knew it was there.
No, absolutely. And this is the use. This is one of those things. Ridley Scott has always been fascinating with how he uses music in films. I mean, whether you're talking about this, whether you're talking about Blade Runner, whether you're talking about some of his movies later where it's a combination of different types of music, not just traditional score, but also, songs. I mean, I'm kind of thinking of Black Hawk Down as an example of that, where it's not just scored by Hans Zimmer. It's just a bunch of other artists that are contributing to the soundscape. It's really interesting to hear the ways in which he comes up with, where he instructs his composers to go from a musical standpoint and to really do something that is, even if we don't necessarily consciously pick up on it on the first view, the next time we see that movie is going to be, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't necessarily pick up on what he's doing, and then it just becomes something that's as vital part of the of watching the movie as the images.
Yeah. But it fascinates me how much of the stuff with the alien has no music at all. Because you'd think, being the iconic creature that it is, that it would have the lion's share of the music.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't, and I don't think the score is meant to be geared that way. It's almost more atmospheric than character driven.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it's like we're so conditioned to expect, it's one of the things that John Williams scores have excelled in, the idea of leitmotifs, the idea of different characters and different ideas and different places having their own specific themes. I mean, that was something that was even in the late 70s. By the time he had done Jaws, he had done Star Wars by this point. So, I mean, that was starting to be something that we kind of expected. So, when somebody gets away from that, I mean, that's never real. And the thing is that the thing that's kind of interesting is it's never really been Goldsmith's game as a composer. I mean, he kind of does that to a certain extent. The Omen.
Well, I mean, remember he did Star Trek: The Motion Picture the same year. That has a pretty iconic Enterprise theme in it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true, and I'll admit I'm not. I'll admit I haven't watched Star Trek: The Motion Picture. So I'm not as familiar with his score for that. But at the same time, I mean, even if you think about Planet of the Apes, there really isn't a defining theme to that movie that goes all the way through, and there isn't really something that goes through the franchise. I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about too. Now, I mean, obviously, you listen to stuff later on, like Basic Instinct. There are themes that you hear, and what am I trying to? Total Recall was another one that I was thinking about. I mean, there are definitely uses, and the next Goldsmith and the Goldsmith film we're talking about later, there are certainly themes that go throughout that. But it's interesting how when he had a chance to make a science fiction film, in that vein, that's kind of a horror film, that he also didn't really go that route.
Yeah, but what's interesting though is, because I mentioned Alien and Star Trek: The Motion Picture were done the same year. And what's interesting is, if you listen to those soundtracks back to back, there's some crossover between them in the quieter moments. Because there's one scene, because off the top of my head, I don't know which one came first, but there's a bit in the motion picture that sounds like it belongs in Alien. To put it that way.
Huh.
And I'm sure that's not an accident.
Right. Okay, so Alien came out in May of 1979, so I'm guessing this came before. I would imagine this came before Motion Picture, because I think Motion Picture was like probably a later release in the year. So let's see what I can see right quick. 79.
December 79.
Yeah, so Alien would have been the first one. I mean, it's certainly not. Yeah, it's certainly not uncommon for composers to reuse motifs, reuse ideas.
But it's not every day you can actually catch it happening, because most of them are good at blending it in so much you don't notice unless you're actively searching it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, Alien is, yeah, I love Alien. It's like, I know a lot of people prefer Aliens, but for me, this one will always be best movie in that franchise, and the score's the big part of it.
Well, I've always said it's not fair to compare Alien to Aliens because Alien is pure horror. It's pure sci-fi horror, I should say, and whereas Aliens is an action movie. So
Yeah.
it's not a fair comparison because they're different genres. I mean, yes, one's a sequel to the other, but it's a sequel set in an entirely different genre than the 1st.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
you can't compare the two on the really because
Yeah.
But
No, you're right on that.
Yeah, in terms of pure horror, I mean, honestly, I know Alien has spawned so many sequels and prequels and stuff. Nothing's come close to topping Alien for sheer fright.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. I mean, it's like even if I have an affection for some of those other ones, it's like none of them really are even close in that vicinity. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that, but the fact of the matter is, it's like, when Ridley Scott did Alien, it's like he understood. He understood. I kind of feel like to a certain extent he understood where horror was headed in that way, and because I mean, you can kind of see similar types of movies being played out. You can definitely see like Jaws being an inspiration for this, or even Halloween, where it's like the alien is essentially a slasher. It's just a very different type of slasher than what we're used to because of how many different ways it can get it. And that's one of the things that's interesting about it.
Yeah, and especially the fact that the alien can and does appear from anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and the use of shadows in the film is just wonderful to where we don't completely even with the chest burster, you don't necessarily even though that's obviously a small version of the alien, you still don't get a clear picture of what the alien's going to look like.
Well, yeah. I mean, the little alien and the big alien, the only similarity is in the head.
Yeah.
Everything else is like, well, and even then, that's another part that's so terrifying is you never once see the alien fully stretched out. They did that on purpose.
Yeah.
Well, partially because if they did, it would have become obvious it was a guy in a rubber suit. But, but since you never see all of it at once, that makes it all the more scary because you're like, where is it? Where's the rest of it?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
And to this day, it boggles my mind that that's a person in there. Like it doesn't seem possible that that's a person. But I've seen the Wikipedia page. He was real. Mm-hmm. Like, and it's like, and that's one of the reasons I feel like the older horror works because like it would not work if that was a CGI creation. If that makes sense.
No, it wouldn't.
All the horror comes from the fact that that is a real thing and the eye knows it and yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And Alien's one of the, I think Alien stands out as well, first of all, Alien stands out, I think, as probably one of the most legitimately, scary movies of all time, and certainly something that is one of the scariest one of the scariest science fiction movies of all time, and in the fact that the helplessness that we feel throughout that film of them being trapped in with this thing is just it's quite something to experience.
Yeah, I mean that's the worst part. It's like they're in space. There's literally nowhere to go.
Yeah. So we're going to shift, and we're going to go to my next choice here, which is 1987's Hellraiser, which the timing of this seems appropriate because we're getting a new take a new take on the world created by Clive Barker, and in this coming week that's coming to Hulu. And this is a score by Christopher Young. And I deliberately chose, there were two specific composers because of how much their work means in the genre, to me at least, that I wanted to highlight in this. And Christopher Young is one of them. He is an acclaimed composer who's best known, I think, for his work in the genre. Hellraiser being one of the best examples. He also has worked with Sam Raimi in Drag Me to Hell. He also worked with Scott Derrickson on Sinister. He also worked on The Grudge, the 2004 film. He's done a lot of really terrific genre work over the years. But I think there are a lot of reasons why I wanted to highlight Hellraiser. And I think it's because of the fact that it kind of gets, it's funny because it really gets away from the type of scores that we've talked about at this point, which is very simple, very evocative, focusing on atmosphere, using very quick motifs to get to the emotional point that we're supposed to feel in those films. And this one is the first one where it's a full-blown orchestral explosion of music. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to put up against these scores that we've talked about so far, because that's very unusual. And I kind of feel like even in something like Jaws or Psycho, which are very much orchestral scores, they're not going for this broad, big orchestral theme. They're ultimately about these motifs that build throughout the film. And I think that's one of the things that's so striking about what Young does with Hellraiser.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's the thing is, like, it may be a full orchestral score, but the way that film is set up, you almost don't register it.
Yeah.
Because that kind of like with Suspiria, that I had to take like a 2-week break from movies after I watched Hellraiser. That for a person like me on the spectrum, I found Hellraiser to be almost completely overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Because like that movie wastes no time in getting started with what it's known for.
Yeah.
And yeah, I had to pause a couple times before I could get through it. But oh gosh, what was it? There is one musical part that did stick out to me, and I'm trying to remember when it was. I think it was when what's the girl's name?
Oh, wait a minute. I've got IMDb. Julia?
Maybe
that's yeah, because Kirsty is the niece, I believe. So yeah, Julia is the main female character.
But Kirsty's the one I'm talking about. I think when she solves the box.
Oh yeah.
And there's this music that plays when she's walking down that corridor before she runs into the Cenobites. Is that how you say that?
Either that or Cenobites. I think either way is fine.
But it's like, I don't know. There was something he did about the music in those parts where it's like for such a brutal movie, it was surprisingly delicate.
Yeah.
And I've noticed a lot of horror movies seem to do that. They contrast the brutality with this light, almost delicate music, and it's such a strange contrast that it just sticks in my head.
I think that kind of goes with the story by Barker and the idea that the Cenobites are these really grotesque characters, but they also are offering pleasure to people. And I think it's that dichotomy. I think it's that contrast of the profane, these profane characters who are wanting to give people who solve that box pleasure and finding pleasure in pain. I feel like that's part of the reason that Christopher Young and under Clive Barker's instruction probably went in that direction.
That does make a twisted amount of sense.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing with the Cenobites is for them, pain and pleasure are the same thing. There's no difference.
Yeah.
And so, but another there was another moment when Frank puts himself back together for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
The music for that moment, wow.
Yeah.
That, talk about perfectly writing music to accompany a very messed up scene. Well, because that's the thing. Like, you have to be careful with moments like that, because the wrong music can ruin a scene. And so, because you don't want to make it too over the top, or the audience won't take it seriously, no matter how grotesque it is.
Yeah.
But he nailed it. Like, there's just enough. There's a mix of horror and revulsion in the music. Like, you're just geared to think, even by the sound alone, like, this is the most horrifying thing I have ever seen, but you can't look away.
Mm-hmm.
And that scene in the hall, in the corridor to the other world, are like the two big musical moments that stuck out to me from Hellraiser.
Yeah. Clive Barker he's definitely, subtlety is not something that comes with Clive Barker. I mean, if you read him on the page, if you watch the 3 movies that he's made, he definitely is not. Subtlety is not something that he goes for, but at the same time, there's something about his, and especially with this one, because a couple of years ago I did a piece for the Patreon on Clive Barker, and I basically read all of the short stories and novellas that he himself had adapted into films, for Hellraiser, for Nightbreed, and for Lord of Illusions. And one of the things that you really capture from him on the page is that there's something about, he treats his characters very delicately as an author. And there's something about even the most grotesque characters, there's always, like Frank, who is completely a terrible character in the film and on the page, but there's something about his pursuits that Clive Barker can't help but highlight as something that is very human. He doesn't treat his characters in an inhuman way. And I think that's something that's really kind of interesting about his work. And I mean, any author should do the same, but I think especially with as extreme as he goes, it's an interesting choice.
You're going to have to explain that a bit more to me, because like delicate is not a word I would think of for, especially for Hellraiser. And especially not with what happens to Frank. I mean,
admittedly, some of it gets lost in the film. I think I'm referring more to the short story when I use that word in the case of this story. Yeah. But I mean, because of the visual aspect of the film, that does kind of get lost, and Frank is very much seen more as a monster. And
even before what happens to him, he's depraved.
Yeah. But you in the short story, you get more of the dynamic between he and Julia before he goes to the Cenobites.
Yeah,
and I think that's part of where that is something that admittedly kind of gets lost in the film.
Yeah, and that can happen with adaptations too. I mean, it's impossible to translate everything to the screen.
Yeah, but
although I suppose when you said delicate, there is a certain delicacy, I suppose, to the puzzle box itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it has its own music.
I believe it does. Yeah. I was listening to it last night. I believe it does. So,
which is interesting. Like, given what it leads to, that it has such an well, it's like you said about the Cenobites and pleasure. Like, maybe it does make sense that you would have such pretty music for an object that can lead to something very horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and because what really horrifies me is that it's like, it doesn't matter if you open the box by accident or not. If you open it, you're going with them, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And that's what really makes it scary, especially for me, is like, it's like, you mean to tell me if someone who thinks it's just a toy opens it, they're going to be dragged into this hell dimension? Like, that's like,
yeah,
that's true horror. Like, being stuck in a situation you can't escape.
Mm-hmm. But this is actually going to be one of my repertory reviews for Sonic Cinema, revisiting this movie and reviewing it. And I'm looking forward to doing so because of the fact that, I mean, it's a movie that really burned itself onto my head, my brain, when I first watched it, and especially now that after having read the story, it's in listening to the score several times in preparation for this, I just love listening to music because of the fact that really it captures something. It captures a way of telling horrific stories that we don't really get as often, I think, in horror that we're used to. Although, I mean, actually our next score in a way kind of does that in the same way, but it's going to be a different way. But he certainly is. It's another composer who's done that a lot over the years.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go ahead and head into that. So my third score is 1991's.
Well, but before you do, can I add one last thing about Hellraiser?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, because after experiencing it the way I did, if anyone wanting to check out Hellraiser, just be aware that it is a very intense story. I would, if you've only seen casual horror up until now, just be advised, this is a whole nother level of horror. So
Yeah.
I feel it's only.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and Clive Barker is not for the faint of heart. Certainly, I mean, my first experience with his work was Lord of Illusions, but that was very much not even remotely in the same ballpark of what he's doing with Hellraiser or his other film Nightbreed. But Hellraiser is, yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I certainly I do think it's worth putting that caution out there for if you're interested in Hellraiser, especially with the new film coming to Hulu. That this is a tough one. It's more grotesque than anything we've talked about so far. It's more intense in terms of the ways it portrays violence than even Alien and Suspiria, I think.
Oh yeah, way. I could argue it's the most grotesque film on the list.
Oh yeah, I think that's completely fair. It really is, especially compared to the next two, which we'll go ahead and go to. This is my last score, unless you had anything more to say.
No.
Okay. So my last score was for 1991's The Silence of the Lambs, composed by Howard Shore. Howard Shore is another composer that I wanted to make sure in this discussion of horror music that we talked about, because he is so, I mean, most people are more familiar with him as the composer of the Lord of the Rings movies for Peter Jackson now. But he really, and it's funny because of the fact that he also was a band leader on Saturday Night Live early on in his career, and worked on the Blues Brothers, and you can kind of get the feeling that he's got a sense for how to score comedy in his scores for Ed Wood and Dogma in the 90s, but ultimately he is best known for horror. Mainly in his collaborations with David Cronenberg. The reason I did not pick a Cronenberg film is I'm not as familiar with Cronenberg's work in horror as I am other people. So as much as I am some of his later work, like Spider and History of Violence, Eastern Promises, and stuff like that.
Does that mean you haven't seen Crimes of the Future?
I have seen Crimes of the Future, yes.
Okay.
At
least you've seen that.
Yes, I have seen Crimes of the Future. That's a terrific Howard Shore score, actually. But I will, if I'd gone with a Cronenberg score, I would probably want to go with something from the 80s, like Scanners or Videodrome or The Fly.
What about Crash from the 90s?
I will admit I'm due a rewatch on Crash because when I first saw it, I absolutely hated it. But I also was not prepared for Cronenberg at that time. So yeah, I do that. I owe that. I just talked to a friend of mine. It's funny, a friend of mine brought up Crash last week when we were getting together, and I told him the same thing. I'm due for a rewatch on that. I need to give. Now that I'm more familiar with Cronenberg, I need to give that movie another chance. So, but I chose Silence of the Lambs because I think it shows a lot of what Howard Shore really does well effectively when it comes to horror, which is he's somebody who is he's somebody who is really effective at quiet moments, but he also, as well as building atmosphere. And I think that's one of the things that is the main thing I think that is so effective about his work in Silence of the Lambs.
Well, especially considering who's in it. I mean, I was literally scared of Anthony Hopkins because of this movie.
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, I feel like with such a presence as he has, you need require a quieter score because of that. Otherwise, like, because he dominates every scene he's in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's I think because of the fact that this is nominally a horror movie because of the fact that it's dealing with serial killers and it's dealing with horrors of reality. And I think that's part of what makes it even scarier is the fact that there is no supernatural being in this movie. This is the terrors in this movie are coming from man. And I think that's what makes this movie makes this movie terrifying to consider in that way.
Oh yeah. I mean, I hadn't even thought about it like that, but yeah, this is almost the kind of movie you would almost expect there to be a supernatural thing revealed at some point, especially given Dr. Lecter.
Yeah.
I think if it had been revealed that he was like possessed or something, I don't think anyone would have blinked at it.
Mm-hmm.
Except for the fact that it's not in the original story. But
right.
but the fact that it's not, and the fact that I fixate on him every time I talk about this movie, but he speaks so rationally, it's frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And although, to be honest, I'm actually not a big fan of The Silence of the Lambs. Because aside from Anthony Hopkins' performance as Hannibal Lecter, I don't like the rest of this film. It's just not a favorite of mine. The whole thing with Buffalo Bill and all that. I've never been able to quite properly. I've got a copy and I keep trying, and maybe if I watch it a couple more times now that I'm older, maybe I'll have a better appreciation of it now. But when I was in college, I could not get into this movie at all. Because I wanted more of Hannibal Lecter. He's the most interesting part for me.
Right. I can see that because of the fact that Hopkins really does, to a certain extent, it is such a strong character, and it's such an instantly iconic character, even in that first scene, that you do want to feel like this is more of his story than it is Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill is, certainly, I think Buffalo Bill can be an interesting character, but he's also the version of Hannibal Lecter in a way that is not as
refined.
Not as refined, but also not as calculating. Refined is a better way of putting it. And but I think the ways in which Lecter seduces Clarice into his mindset, and even if she doesn't see the world in the same way he does, the fact that she can understand the ways in which he looks at the world is really kind of troubling, and that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this movie, I think.
Yeah, because the parts of the. I really need to rewatch this movie because, I do remember it left me feeling very unsettled when I would get done with it, just because of you have to sort of put yourself, however temporarily, in Lecter's mind view, and that's a very unsettling place to be.
Yeah.
And but I can't get over how Howard Shore being a horror composer. I swear I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And I should have known that. And that sort of explains something to me, because there's bits of horror in The Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that, like when the Watcher in the water grabs Frodo, that's like a horror moment.
Oh yeah. Any moment with the ring race in Lord of the Rings, just
and that
yeah,
and that explains why he was so, how he could do, he could shift in the horror so well. So
yeah. I think it's mainly you have to look at it through that prism of his collaborations with Cronenberg, and because I mean with Jonathan he's worked a lot with Jonathan Demme, the director of this, and they've got a variety of films. I mean this Philadelphia are a couple of them, but I mean you can also see movies like Single White Female, Crash, which is Cronenberg. He did Seven in the Game for David Fincher, and he also did The Cell for Tarzan, which is another one of those that is kind of horror, but also more of as much of a procedural thriller as well, in the same way that Silence of the Lambs is.
Now I have to ask: did Shore do Hannibal as well, the sequel to this?
No, Hans Zimmer did Hannibal.
Okay.
Yeah. And I love Hans Zimmer's score for Hannibal, but yeah, there's something about, but I love it because of the fact that it's an instance of Hans Zimmer doing horror in his way. But I think The Ring is the better example of that, really. Silence of the Lambs very much feels in keeping with a lot of the ways in which Howard Shore composes horror, in the way he uses very, very evocative senses of dread when it comes to, building up. This is so much of this movie is all about building up tension in scene, as opposed to quick bursts of tension, like what you were talking about earlier with Halloween.
Yeah, but isn't there is Silence of the Lambs the one where Lecter's listening to classical music, or is that Hannibal? I get the two confused.
I think he does so in both, but I do remember there being a scene in Silence of the Lambs where he's listening to classical music, but I know Hannibal uses it too.
Because it's just an interesting contrast, like having such refined music in a such a horrifying story. Only in this case, it's diegetic and not something the composer specifically created.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like once again that contrast comes up, and I'm starting to think that's a trope of horror films I really need to write about. Because I'm just realizing as I lined them up, so many horror films will pair up the opposite, or music that you would think would be opposite to a horror film, and I guess that would keep you unsettled as the viewer.
Yeah, this is a movie that really doesn't play a lot with definitive themes for characters, and I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, you do get a sense of themes for Clarice and for Hannibal Lecter, but they're not as instantly identifiable as some of the other ones that we've talked about, especially for Halloween. And I think that's kind of interesting.
It could almost be argued that there aren't proper themes in this one too. I mean, they don't have to be proper themes in the score for any film. And I've certainly never thought of this particular one in terms of themes, and that might be partially why I subconsciously don't like it as much, because I gravitate towards leitmotivic music.
Right.
And so the ones that are more atmospheric or evocative, like the Silence of the Lambs, I have trouble with them because I feel like there's less to grab onto. It's so there. There's nothing to quantify.
Yeah. Well, No, go ahead.
Well, and that could be because I'm on the spectrum, so I view things a certain way. But I've always struggled a bit with scores like this.
That's interesting, but actually it does. But that does make a lot of sense, though. And I mean, not just in the context you're referring to, though, but just in general, because of the fact that, I mean, and really it does kind of make sense that leitmotifs have very much become a natural staple to a lot of film music because of the fact that it does give the viewer something to latch on to. And this is approaching film music in a very different way, almost in not necessarily in an experimental way, but really also keeping in with that idea that the music should almost be, you shouldn't really notice the music to a certain extent while you're watching the film.
Mm-hmm. And I would say I would say they definitely succeed in this one because, you know, there's a lot of movies I can think of it and a little snippet of music will pop up in my head. But I don't get that with Silence of the Lambs. The only thing I can conjure is visual, and that's Lecter in a cell. Probably the most iconic image from the movie, if I had to take a guess.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the most iconic one. Yeah, it's this one is, yeah, I mean this one is interesting, but I mean I think because of I think sort of because one of the things I do like, and you know, it's especially comes into play when we're talking about our last score here, is that one of the things I like about this is that we're talking about a wide variety of film music and film composition and ideas of how film music can work in a film. Not just obviously in terms of supporting the film, but how the music goes about its business in supporting the movie. And I think that's one of the reasons I was really excited about this one, is because of the fact that all of these kind of go about it in very different ways.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else that you add on Silence of Lambs before we go to our next one?
I don't.
Sorry. Okay, that's fine. That's quite all right. And so we are going to conclude with your third choice, and we're going to leave on a sense of fun that is very much missing from the previous 5 films. Is 1999's The Mummy, composed by Jerry Goldsmith.
Yeah, I was so worried I was worried that when I mentioned this that you wouldn't go for it as for horror, because it's honestly, I know it's a remake of one of Karloff's horror films from the 30s, but I think people forget this is technically a horror movie.
I will admit, I mean, I was, you know, I'll admit, when I first saw it, I'm like, that's an interesting choice. Not quite horror, but, you know, I was associating it with, as, well, it's a remake of the old Universal Monster movie, or an updated version of the Universal Monster movie. So, okay, yeah. And then I listened to it, and one of the things that did strike me so much is that, first and foremost, you get the strong sense of adventure, of fun that most people associate with this movie.
Yeah.
But one of the great things about what Goldsmith does in this score is he never forgets the horror roots of this story.
Oh, absolutely not. And that's part of why I picked it. This is one of my favorite. I've been a fan of Goldsmith probably as long as I've been a fan of John Williams, and this is one of my favorites. It's very late Goldsmith, and I often like to call it like the last gasp of old Hollywood, because he was one of the classic greats.
Yeah.
And this was sadly only a few years before he died. So this is like hearing a horror film as one of the old greats did it.
Yeah.
And they just don't make them like this anymore.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And I was, I did find it kind of interesting that you did pick two scores from Goldsmith, but not surprising because Goldsmith was one of the greats, and even though he had been around for decades, we still lost him way too soon.
It's always too soon when they're that good.
And, yeah. And it's one of those things where I'll admit I'm probably like one of the only people on film Twitter that's not a huge fan of this movie. But
really?
I mean, it's fine. It's just I don't have the same affection for it that other people do. But I mean, there are certainly things I enjoy about the movie now. But I will say, listening to the score, I love listening to the score because I'm not as familiar with it as I am some of the other ones that we're talking about. Because of the fact that I don't necessarily equate it with horror the way that I equate all of the other ones that we've talked about with horror. But I love that this is very big and broad, and part of that is the adventure that is paramount in this. First and foremost, stands out in this film, but also the fact that when he goes to that place of horror, and I mean I mentioned The Omen's his score for The Omen earlier. But I mean, he wrote he wrote another one of the definitive horror music scores of all time in The Omen, which was his only Oscar win. And I love that Goldsmith always had this sense of creating atmosphere, but also capable of doing something that is very what's the word I'm trying to for it?
There are leitmotifs in this one for sure.
Oh yeah, very much so.
I mean, because you said how we've been moving through and things are slowly becoming more orchestrated. This is like the most orchestrated symphonic of all the scores we've talked about.
Yeah,
and I felt also as it's a very romantic kind of horror that he goes for, and I like how it's like, even keeping with the full orchestra, there's that whole horror and menace, especially when Imhotep and his priests are being punished.
Yeah.
That's probably the prime example, because like it's just the music just grind. There's maybe it's not proper music, but there's definitely something grinding in the background that underlines the horror of what's happening to them. Aside from what you're seeing, of course,
right?
But I think he really kicks it up a notch once Imhotep starts getting his powers. All the music with that, it's like, that's when it becomes epic in scale. Like, it's not the intimate kind of horror like with Alien. This is horror on a grand scale.
Yeah. This is very much in keeping with the tradition of the Universal monster movies and how their scores sounded, and even the Hammer horror films. I mean, I've seen both the Universal Mummy from the 30s. I've seen the Hammer version of the Mummy. I've seen this one, and even as radically different as all three of those are, they're still telling fundamentally the same story in fundamentally the same way, but it's the way that they're different that is interesting to look at. And this one is certainly playing up more the Indiana Jones. It's melding the Universal monster movie with Indiana Jones.
But it works, though. I mean,
it does, yeah.
I mean, and that's why it's endured so well all these years. Is that it's, there's so much action adventure mixed in that even the moviegoers that aren't usually horror fans are willing to overlook those parts because the adventure part is so good.
Yeah.
But the horror parts, I'm impressed how well they've held up because this was made in the late 90s. CGI's come a long way since then.
Yeah.
But the effects hold up, and I'm impressed at how well they hold up. Especially when Imhotep's in his first resurrected form, when he's all digital. I don't know if you've seen the movie recently, but
it's been a few years. We covered it on the podcast for our class of 1999 series. So I saw it in 2019 was the last time I saw it.
Okay. Well, because like he comes back to life in stages. So that first stage where he's just this withered husk, that part has held up extremely well. Even when he first gets his parts, like, yeah, you can kind of tell it's digital, but it's not bad looking like how some graphics have badly aged.
Yeah. I do think there are some moments. I do remember from my last viewing that I did feel like some of the moments didn't hold up that well. I think some of them don't, but I do think there are some moments that very much do.
Yeah, it's not perfect by any means, but it's I've seen far worse of things that haven't held up. Resident Evil comes to mind when I say that.
Yeah, I will. Yeah,
you know exactly what I'm talking about too, don't you?
Not really, because I haven't kept up with that series because I didn't like the first one, so I didn't even bother with any of them. But my wife is a fan of that series, so I'm sure I'll watch it at some point.
Well, in the first movie, the one that you say you don't like, everything's great until the liquor comes out, I think. And it's clearly a fully CGI creation, and it looks bad. So bad it took me out of the moment instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I say I've seen far worse examples of effects that have aged very, very badly.
Yeah.
I mean, so by contrast, you have a movie that came out 3 years earlier, and it's held up far better than that effect did.
Mm-hmm. Well, to a certain extent, I think that also is, for all my, I'm, we talked about how I'm not as big a fan of this as other people are. At the same time, I can certainly see why people still have the same affection for it. I mean, that great sense of affection for it because of the performances, especially by Brandon Fraser and Rachel Weisz, and I mean just everybody in the cast. They know what they're doing, and the fact is, this ultimately knows what it is, and I think because of the fact that it has that sense of fun, it has that sense of throwing back to the old serial adventures. I think even when some of the effects don't necessarily work, you can still kind of overlook it because of the fact that you're having a lot of fun watching it.
I mean, there's definitely a nostalgia factor at work here for sure. Just because it is like resurrecting, however briefly, classic Hollywood and what made those stories so good, and the fact that Goldsmith was there to score it just made it that much better.
Yeah.
Especially I love how the music opened in ancient Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
That first big, when I know the city that's presented is completely inaccurate, but I don't care. It's glorious. I was like, there's a pyramid and as soon as you see the big painted Sphinx, you're in for a ride.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, yes, it's inaccurate, but I don't care. But I don't care. It looks for an ancient Egypt nut like me. That whole opening montage is glorious,
Mm-hmm.
and the music just, you feel right away that you're in the ancient past, and even though we don't know what ancient Egyptian music sounded like, he still nailed the feeling that you're there in this whole other world.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've always been fascinated by with Goldsmith in particular is his use of synthesizers in movies. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple moments where he uses in this, and this isn't the same as when Hans Zimmer uses synthesizers in his movies, or the way even John Carpenter uses synthesizers in his movies. The thing that I love about Goldsmith is that it's just when he uses synthesizers in movies, even in something like this, it doesn't sound anachronistic to the time period that the movie's set in, because of the fact that it's an organic part of the orchestra where it just has its moment to come in and then it drops off. That's right. And I love the way he's done that over the years with synthesizers.
Yeah, and that's the very best know how to do that. Like, you can take an instrument that you do it wrong, the audience will notice. Yeah. But if you do it right, like I said, it's very organic, and so you don't question why it's there because it feels proper.
Yeah.
And this isn't, we were talking about earlier about how in movies you need to know when to use silence. The Mummy has a really good example of that right at the end. When Benny gets what's coming to him.
Yeah.
There's no music. All you can hear are the Scarab Beetles. Even before the light goes out, like it's almost like all the trap sliding shut was a cue for the music to stop.
Yeah.
And all you hear is like his panic, his breathing, like, what am I going to do? I'm trapped underground. And then you hear the Scarab Beetles. Thousands of them.
Yeah.
And they're just coming in, circling around him, and then it gets darker and darker. And then the sound leaves nothing to the imagination, but there's not a note of music to go with it. And it's just a perfect example of how sometimes you don't need music to have a satisfying moment in a movie, especially when a character is getting their, from almost the moment you meet Benny, something bad's going to happen to this guy at some point. and it's like the perfect comeuppance for a guy like that.
Mm-hmm.
But also there's another theme I like in there. It's the music Goldsmith came up with for the love between Imhotep and Anaxunamun.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the themes I remember. It comes up several times, and I'm pretty sure it gets quoted in the sequel, even though Goldsmith didn't do that one.
Mm-hmm.
So because I know Silvestri did The Mummy Returns.
Yeah.
But it's one of those, and I understood why it's so sympathetic once I saw the original film, because I only saw the original last year.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. I did not grow up on the Universal horror films. I only just recently got them, relatively speaking. So yeah, I've got them all now. So it was only like last year or maybe the year before that I saw The Mummy.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized even more, like, by The Mummy Returns, I understood like the sympathetic side of their love affair, but the original really helped me see that you're really meant to feel sorry for Imhotep.
Yeah.
And that's kind of colored now how I watch the 99 film.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he really is in so many ways a tragic figure.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, even more than Karloff's Imhotep,
mm-hmm.
because you know, well, actually no. Karloff's Imhotep did not kill the pharaoh, I don't think. I forgot about that part. But still, like, he did it all out of love.
Yeah.
And he came within a fingertip of bringing her back.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that scene gets me every time. Like, you know, even that has a bit of horror in it when her soul is being dragged back to her body.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's like, that could have come straight out of the 30s. You know, that moment when she's gasping back to life, that could have come right out of a 30s film.
Yeah.
And that was probably meant to be an homage to that too. I mean, and then, you know, he's so close, but then he gets it taken away. Like, I feel that musically, I feel that pain every time. Like, you know, it's amazing how well he did it in such a way that you feel bad for the villain.
Yeah.
Although there's been whole arguments about, is he a villain? You know,
it's like, it's one of those things where, I mean, in comparison to our main characters, he is the villain, but in
Mm-hmm.
terms of him as a character, I think he's more of a tragic character than he is an out and out bad guy. So
yeah, I mean, I would say if you could ask him, he certainly wouldn't view himself as a villain. He's just, you know, he only has, and this is the part that always boggled my mind about this movie. Like, you know, why would you curse a guy with something that would give him so much power if he ever got dug up?
Right.
You know, because like, you know, like, because like, if you bury something, there's always the chance that it will be unburied is small, but never zero.
Yeah, exactly. And we're finding that out in real life. It's like, it almost seems like every few weeks we get something being uncovered, and it's like, yeah, now it's probably, I mean, did you not see the Mummy movies? I mean, you should know not to do this.
Yeah, it was like when they found that weird shaped sarcophagus in Egypt, we were all like, we've seen the Mummy, do not open that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so it's like, and so that's the one part I struggle with. It's like, why would you do that? It's like the only reason he has these powers is because you gave them to him.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a whole lot left to say on the Mummy. It's Goldsmith. And if you are not necessarily sure whether it fits in with this discussion, go back and re-listen to it, because you'll definitely find the ways in which it does.
Yeah, I mean, but that's, I think a lot of people. Yeah, if you listen to it, you'll tell that it may not be pure horror, but it is in the same family.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's an interesting contrast to, like, you know, like I said, there's 20 years between The Mummy and Alien. It's, you know, how his style changed over all that time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, that's one of the things that I like about covering really following film music, following different composers, because you do listen, as you listen to their work over the years, you do hear how it's changed, how it's evolved, and in some ways how it's how it stayed the same, but it's always exciting when you hear a composer, especially one like Goldsmith, who had already been in the business for, like 20 years, I think, when Alien came out, and then
Something like that.
And then at least 20 years more by the time he did The Mummy, just to hear the ways in which he was continually changing and coming up with new ways to express himself musically and help bring these stories to life.
Mm-hmm. Like I said at the start, they don't make movie scores like that anymore, but I'm glad we've got that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad, I'm really glad that you put that on your list, because of the fact that it did give me a chance to go back and listen to it and go, oh, okay, yeah, now I completely hear why this was one of her choices. This makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Becky, thank you very much for the discussion today and for joining me to talk about film music.
My pleasure. We will definitely have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, and I will. I already have a couple of ideas in mind that will probably make that possible. But before we sign off, where can people find you online?
You can find me. My blog is www.filmmusiccentral.com. That's where I do my blog posts. Although I'll admit I don't post as often as I used to, but I try to post at least once a month. You can also find me on Twitter at musicgamer460. And if you want to keep really up to date with what I'm writing, I also write for Cinelinx. That's CINELINX.
Okay. Well, Becky, thank you very much for joining me. And yeah, we'll definitely have you on again.
I'm looking forward to it.
I'd like to thank Becky for joining me on the podcast today. Like I said, that was kind of a long time coming discussion, and I'm really glad we were able to have it. And I'm glad it was about horror soundtracks, because I really love horror films and horror soundtracks, and it's always fun to listen to how different people approach the genre, and I think we had some great examples of that this time. That's going to be it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. We've got some more great discussions coming up, and this is going to be a fun end of 2022. As always, this is Brian Scuttle. Check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Check me out at the Sonic Cinema Podcast, wherever you listen to it, including the YouTube channel, as well as www.sonic-cinema.com.